Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for being here this evening for the faculty by faculty lecture series. My name is, I know many of you, I don't know all of you. My name is Rick Locke. I am a professor here in International and Public Affairs and Political Science, and I currently serve as Provost, and it's really wonderful to have you all here, especially for this lecture featuring Professor Paul Guyer, who is the Jonathan Nelson Professor of Humanities and Philosophy and currently serves as chair of the Department of Philosophy. Now, a number of you have participated in this series before. I recognize you, but not all of you have been here before. And I just want to hope that you keep on coming. It's really been a very exciting series of events. Our next speaker will be Professor Diane Lipscomb, who's here, who will be speaking on April 5th. Now, we launched this series, I guess the first lecture was in the spring of 2016. And we launched it because one of the things that I noticed was in my first year as provost was visiting different departments, speaking to lots of faculty, and learning about all the incredible research that was being done here, and also hearing from the faculty about the hunger they felt for intellectual community, of being able to be brought together so they could share their work with one another, even across very, very different fields. And as a result, we started this series in the spring of 2016 and has been incredibly successful. I mean, you can just sort of feel the energy in today's, this evening, but it's been true in all the others. And we will continue doing this next academic year. So if you have any suggestions or want to even self-volunteer to speak, please get in touch with my office. Tonight, we have the good fortune to hear from our colleague, Paul Guyer. Paul came to Brown in 2012 as the inaugural Jonathan Nelson Professor of Humanities and Philosophy, and the first faculty member to be hired as part of the university's Humanities initiative. He is the author, editor, and/or translator of 25 books, many concerning the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. His most recent book on Kant is Virtues of Freedom, published in 2016, which is a collection of essays on Kant's moral philosophy. In the announcement that the university put out when his appointment became public, it was noted that his status as one of the world's foremost scholars of the work of Kant began early with a routine assignment in high school. As a junior in high school, he was instructed to write about a book of essays. And this is what it said. The 16-year-old Guyer picked up a 45-cent copy of David Hume's Essays Concerning Human Understanding at a Penn Station bookstore while he was waiting for a train to go home to Long Island. He began to read this book and was immediately struck. And it was reported that although Paul found the writing gorgeous, quote unquote, I'm taking it from the announcement, something about the philosopher's argument didn't quite sit well with him. And so he set out to find a rebuttal to Hume's theory. And this led him to the works of the German philosopher Kant, which took him down a scholarly path that has sparked a driving interest that has fueled Guyer's research for over 40 years. In addition to Paul's expertise in the work of Kant, he has also done extensive research on the history of modern aesthetics, and his 3-volume work on the subject was published in 2014. Before coming to Brown, he was the Florence Murray Professor in Humanities at the University of Pennsylvania. And he has won fellowships, all the top fellowships, Guggenheim, 2 National Endowment of the Humanities, the Daimler Fellowship of the American Academy of Berlin, the von Humboldt Foundation Research Prize, and he's a member of the American Academy of Sciences. I can go on, but I think you get the point. It is really with great pleasure to be able to welcome Paul to the series, and please join me in bringing him up and welcoming him.
Thank you, Rick, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out. The talk that I'll give you tonight is part of a small part of the project that I was working on at the American Academy last spring. It will be a book about the intellectual relationship between Immanuel Kant and Moses Mendelssohn. Kant, extremely well-known philosopher of the 18th century, in my view at least the most important philosopher of modern times. Mendelssohn, well-known in Jewish studies, less well-known in the history of philosophy, certainly a lesser figure than Kant, but a figure that Kant took very seriously. Mendelssohn, born 5 years after Kant, made his reputation earlier than Kant did, and in my view, Kant was looking over his shoulder at Mendelssohn throughout his career. Mendelssohn is often thought of as the archetypical rationalist to whom Kant is refuting. I think actually both of them were involved in a common project of trying to find the right balance between rationalism and empiricism. And I think, in fact, Kant often ended up being the better rationalist, but Mendelssohn, in many ways, the better empiricist. Anyway, that'll be the larger thesis of the book. It won't come out so much in this talk. Anyway, without wasting more time, I'll get to the talk. So the principle of freedom of religion, that is the freedom to practice the religion of one's choice or not to practice any religion at all, has seemed to be well entrenched in the modern world. The first clause of the First Amendment to our Constitution states simply that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, that is the non-establishment clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the free exercise clause. So government shall neither promote nor interfere with the practice of religion. A century and a half after our Constitution, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations declared that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. This is the equivalent, I think, of the Free Exercise Clause of the American First Amendment. And as the equivalent of the Non-Establishment Clause, the UN Declaration added that no one may be compelled to belong to an association, an unqualified prohibition that, understood as such, denies to governments as well as to any other agencies, including religious organizations, the right to compel individuals to belong to or support any religious organization as well as any political party or other type of association. Now, of course, even countries apparently committed to the principle of religious liberty have differed on what it means in practice. In the United States, for example, placing the tablets of the Ten Commandments in a public courthouse or a creche on its main interior staircase has been held to be a violation of the Non-Establishment Clause, but to prohibit teachers or students from wearing religious symbols or garb would be considered a violation of the Free Exercise Clause, and they're not understood to be speaking for the state. In France, by contrast, the wearing of such items in school is considered a violation of the state's laicity and banned, presumably because both teachers and students are considered in some way to be speaking for or representing the state when in school. Reasonable people can disagree about such applications of general principles on which they agree. Now, in the current, it seems not very reasonable state of the world, the principle of religious liberty is under much more stress than ordinary disputes about the details of the application of a general principle to which everyone subscribes. Here we have a president with no apparent religious views or principles of his own, who has nevertheless sold our birthright for a mess of pottage, that is, bought the vote of the religious right with promises of religious privileges, or at least dog whistles for such promises. In Europe, as well as the United States, fears of terrorism and a tidal wave of refugees has given rise to pressures to exclude Islam from the protection of religious toleration, and anti-Semitism has raised its ugly head again as well. What can philosophy say in such a situation? Well, when a principle seems self-evident, it's still the task of philosophy to search for a good argument for it. The result of such a search might be to show that the principle is not certain after all. Or the search might reveal that there is a solid basis for the principle, even when the principle no longer seems self-evident or has come under question. I want to argue that the principle of religious liberty can be grounded on more basic assumptions, but that one foundation for it is more secure than another. And I'll do this here by contrasting the arguments for religious liberty that were offered by Moses Mendelssohn on the one hand and Immanuel Kant on the other. Now, there would not seem to be much daylight between Kant and Mendelssohn on the subject of religious liberty. Both deny to both governments and religions themselves the right either to compel or interfere with religious practice. Kant's great book, Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, from 1793, is at least in part an argument with Mendelssohn's equally great Jerusalem, or on the religious power and Judaism, that was published a decade earlier. Kant overtly argues with Mendelssohn's interpretation of Judaism and more subtly with Mendelssohn's acceptance of religious pluralism, but he doesn't seem to disagree about the necessity of keeping government out of religious affairs. In fact, while Mendelssohn's book consists of two parts, the first arguing that government should not be in the business of privileging any one religion, and therefore not in the business of restricting any other religion, the second reconciling the Jewish practice of divine commandments with an Enlightenment conception of a religion founded in pure reason, Kant's book seems to address only the second part of Mendelssohn's work, his interpretation of Judaism. This might leave the impression that there was no disagreement between himself and Mendelssohn on the question of religious liberty and its grounds. But I'll suggest something different. Kant might have thought that he didn't need to talk about the principle of religious liberty in his book on religion because that topic had already been addressed by him in a brief essay in 1784 and would be more fully addressed in the further exposition of his political philosophy, which was next on his agenda after the religion book. But the very fact that Kant could have thought that this topic would be adequately addressed entirely within his political philosophy demonstrates that his argument for religious liberty does not itself rest on any religious premises. Here I think that Kant differs from Mendelssohn and from much of the mainstream 18th century thought about religious liberty. Kant derives the separation of church and state directly from the imperative of preserving human freedom itself, the purely moral premise that is the foundation of his political philosophy. And this, I think, makes his argument for religious liberty more secure than one that rests on any religious premises and is therefore open to objection by those who might hold different religious premises. Now, arguments for religious liberty were common throughout the European Enlightenment, but often based on religious premises. Before I turn to Mendelssohn, I'll just briefly illustrate that general claim. James Madison's 1785 Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments was an argument against a bill in the Virginia legislature that would have established a state provision for teachers of the Christian religion, that is, the use of public money raised by compulsory taxation to pay for such teachers. Madison's argument carried the day, and the Virginia Assembly defeated the bill, although the religious right seems to continue the fight for state support of religious instruction to this day. But Madison's argument rests on religious premises. The crucial points in his argument are that, first, religion concerns the personal and inward conviction of believers. Secondly, that individuals have a God-given right to their own convictions. And third, that in any case, the means available to the state, namely coercive means, threats of punishment, can modify people's outward behavior but cannot reach their inward convictions. So it's at best idle and at worst irrational for the state to attempt the inculcation of any religious convictions. The first two of these premises are religious in nature, even if the last is not. I'll spare you the quotation. Now, Mendelssohn, writing in 1783, could not have known of Madison's 1785 remonstrance, nor is Madison likely to have known of Mendelssohn's book, which was not translated into English until 50 years after Madison wrote, and just very shortly after Madison died. But neither would have needed to know the work of the other to come up with a similar position, since both were drawing on a common tradition stemming from John Locke's letter concerning toleration of 1689. Locke's argument is based on the premise that, quote, it is the duty of the civil magistrate, by impartially enacted equal laws, to preserve and secure for all people in general, and for every one of his subjects in particular, the just possession of these things that belong to this life, but that the care of souls is not committed to the civil magistrate any more than to other men, because it does not appear that God ever gave any such authority to any one man over another as to compel other men to embrace his religion. And further, Locke continues, no man, even if he would, can believe at another's dictation. It is faith that gives force and efficacy to the true religion that brings salvation, unquote. Now, in these brief remarks, Locke makes clear the religiously neutral assumption that inner convictions cannot be modified by the outward tools available to the state, but he also makes clear his Protestant conviction that only freely adopted convictions are acceptable to God, and that God has given everyone the authority to form his own religious convictions, not having delegated this to anyone, let alone civil authorities. This is an argument made on the premises of one religion for freedom for other religions, as long as they also observe the strict boundary between religious conviction and civil security, the latter being the source of Kant's sole restriction on religious liberty, namely that all are free to believe and profess whatever they want, as long as their practices, quote, do not prejudice other men's rights or disturb the public peace, unquote, which is what magistrates are charged to protect. For that reason, Locke thought it acceptable to demand oaths because he thought that civil security depended on them, and he thought it acceptable to exclude the practice of Catholicism from the otherwise general scope of religious liberty because, in his view, the papists were assumed to be loyal to a foreign secular power. Now, Mendelssohn's argument, to come to him, for a strict separation between church and state is in the same vein. Mendelssohn's position is not identical to Locke's, and on several points, such as the necessity of oaths, it's explicitly directed against Locke. But on two key issues, namely the religious foundation of the necessity of religious liberty, and on the non-religious premise that coercion cannot change inward convictions, Mendelssohn is in agreement with Locke, and it seems to me that his argument, like Locke's, is vulnerable on both of these points. Now, Jerusalem begins with the claim that finding the correct balance between, quote, state and religion, civil and ecclesiastical constitution, secular and churchly authority, unquote, remains an unsolved problem in spite of the centuries of effort devoted to it. Mendelssohn is worried about civil interference in properly religious matters, religious interference in properly civil matters, but also about excessive cooperation between church and state. Quote, for they seldom agree, but for the purpose of banishing from their realms a third moral entity, freedom of conscience, which knows how to derive some advantage from their disunity, unquote. Mendelssohn then reprises Locke's distinction between the goals of state and of religion in the following way. On Mendelssohn's interpretation of Locke, quote, a state is a society of men who unite for the purpose of collectively promoting their temporal welfare, and from this it follows quite naturally that the state is not to concern itself at all with citizens' convictions regarding their eternal happiness, but is to tolerate everyone who conducts himself well as a citizen, that is, who does not interfere with the temporal happiness of his fellow citizens, unquote. Mendelssohn's first criticism of Locke is then that a distinction between temporal and eternal happiness cannot be applied rigidly to the case of religion, because true religion also concerns temporal happiness, and further, in his view, eternal happiness is to be earned only through contribution to the temporal happiness of one's fellows. Conversely, he doesn't see a need to, quote, restrict the purpose of society solely to the temporal. He says, if men can promote their eternal happiness by public measures, it should be their natural duty to do so, unquote. Mendelssohn believes that in principle, both state and church can work toward the perfection and therefore the happiness of human beings, the state by influencing human actions and religion by influencing human convictions. So unlike Locke, then, Mendelssohn does not rigidly separate the goals of church and state. Rather, his argument is that the coercive instruments of the state are incompatible with religion's need for inner conviction in order for people to be well-pleasing to God. Religion requires the free conviction of each as the condition of his eternal happiness. So the only way to promote the eternal as well as the temporal happiness of all is to ensure each person the freedom to develop his or her own convictions. Religion, Mendelssohn says, knows no act without conviction, no work without spirit, no conformity indeed without conformity in the mind. Religious actions without religious thoughts are mere puppetry, not service of God. They themselves must therefore proceed from the spirit and can neither be purchased by reward nor compelled by punishment, unquote. This is the religious premise that the Jewish Mendelssohn shares with his Protestant peers from Locke to the Virginia legislators. And without it, the factual premise to which he then turns, namely that coercion cannot produce conviction, would be irrelevant. Now, although Mendelssohn does not separate the goals of church and state as rigorously as Locke did, he still wants to keep the state from either establishing or interfering with religion. In some ways, he goes further than Locke, rejecting the requirement of religiously grounded oaths, as I said before, as a condition for any civil action or privilege, and of rejecting the idea that Locke accepts, and that most rabbis of Mendelssohn's time accepted, namely that churches should have the right to exercise their own form of coercion by excommunicating non-conforming members. The distinction between coercion on the one hand and instruction and persuasion as the means to conviction on the other is even more important to Mendelssohn than it was to Locke. Mendelssohn argues that the state can use coercion to protect the rights of citizens by imposing duties upon others, even though in such cases the state will have to be, quote, content, if need be, with conformity of action without conformity in thought, unquote. That is, with outward compliance with its laws, even in the absence of inward commitment to or conviction of the validity of those laws. But in other cases, the state, and in all cases, according to Mendelssohn, religion, can use only persuasion or education as its means, what Locke called exhortations and arguments for faith and inward sincerity. Mendelssohn writes that the state has physical power and uses it when necessary, but the power of religion is love and beneficence. So he claims religious society lays no claim to the right of coercion and cannot obtain it by any possible contract, unquote. So it's impermissible for the state to apply coercive means to religious ends, for example, to establish one religion or give one religion preference over others, and it's impermissible for religions themselves to apply coercive means, for example, to excommunicate members, even without civil penalties, as Locke had argued, let alone with civil penalties. Equally, Mendelssohn holds that religious institutions can use only educational, not coercive means. Religious institutions can and must admonish, instruct, fortify, and comfort, but churches have no right to coerce their members or states, and states have no right to coerce churches. And on this basis, Mendelssohn argues that churches, by which he means organized religious institutions of any denomination, have no right to the goods and properties of their members, no right to internal governments with judicial and executive powers, no right to restrict the freedom of inquiry of their members, no right to excommunicate members, but instead an obligation to educate them. And he argues that neither church nor state has a right to demand oaths. I'll spare you the details of this. The main point is, if I can find it, that all of these arguments depend upon the assumption that religious duties are satisfied only by free inward conviction. And then the problem with Mendelssohn's argument is that both the religious premise that religion requires only free inward conviction and the factual premise that coercion cannot affect conviction are both open to challenge. an alternative to Mendelssohn's style of argument, as well as that of the Anglo-American tradition of non-establishment and tolerance, which depends upon the same premises, would be a straightforward argument that the function of the state is to preserve and promote the freedom of all to set their own ends, and that the duty of the state to protect the freedom of all to believe in practice religion as they see fit, as long as their practice does not disturb the public peace, is simply a corollary of that more general principle that does not require any further premises. This is what Kant offers, as I suggested in his political writings rather than his book on religion, precisely because his argument is not founded on religious premises. There we go, Kant. Okay, so now I turn to Kant. For Kant, freedom not only to believe, but also to practice the religion of one's choice, or to omit religious practice, is rooted directly in what he calls the universal principle of right, which states that any action is right if it can coexist with everyone's freedom, or if the freedom of choice of each can coexist with everyone's freedom. He makes no special assumptions about the nature and point of religion. The universal principle of right is grounded directly on the fundamental principle of morality, which itself does not depend on any religious assumption. So, in Kant's view, religious liberty is a fundamental moral obligation of all human beings towards all human beings, to be enforced but not undermined by their governments, because their governments are charged with enforcing a subset of human moral obligations that includes this one. If it's sound, this argument must be endorsed by anyone, independently of specifically religious beliefs. Now, there are some aspects of my interpretation of Kant's moral and political philosophy that are controversial. I've defended them at great length elsewhere. Obviously, I can't defend them now. I'll just be very brief about this. As Kant presents his view, famously in a book entitled The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, 1785, the foundation of all moral obligation is the imperative, quote, so act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or that of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means, unquote. Since by humanity, Kant eventually makes clear he means the capacity to set our own ends, this amounts to the requirement to treat our capacity to set our own ends always as an end, never merely as a means. I'm not to treat my own capacity to set ends as a mere means, for example, to mere pleasure, nor am I to treat anyone else's capacity to set ends as mere means to the realization of my own. And since the capacity to set our own ends is, in Kant's view, the most fundamental form of our freedom, this means that the fundamental principle of morality, or the essential end of humankind as Kant calls it, is to restrict our actions to those, quote, conditions under which alone the greatest use of freedom is possible and under which it can be self-consistent. That is, my use of freedom on one occasion consistent with my use of freedom on other occasions, and my use of freedom consistent with your use of freedom, everyone's use of freedom. The use of freedom has to be restricted because some uses of freedom are inconsistent with others. My killing somebody else, considered by itself, might be a free act on my part, but it would obviously be incompatible with any further use of freedom by the other. So thus Kant concludes that insofar as it is not restrained under certain rules of conditional employment, freedom is the most terrible thing that there could ever be, but freedom has to be restricted not by other properties and faculties, but by itself, he says. That is, by the requirement that all uses of freedom be self-consistent. Now, what Kant calls right or justice is that part of morality that morality itself requires to be coercively enforced when necessary. To be sure, we attain what Kant calls moral worth, or sometimes virtue, by being motivated by the thought of duty or respect for the moral law alone. This is actually Kant's moral analog for the more traditional religious view that outward deeds without inward conviction are not pleasing to God. But the moral law requires that we not destroy freedom that is compatible with freedom under any circumstances, whether we're moved by the thought of the moral law in those circumstances or not. So morality itself requires that we put into place what Kant calls juridical laws, which admit an incentive other than the idea of duty itself. And this is because, in Kant's view, very compact little argument he makes. Whatever is wrong is a hindrance to freedom in accordance with universal laws. Coercion is a hindrance or resistance to freedom. Therefore, if a certain use of freedom is itself a hindrance to freedom in accordance with universal laws, that is wrong. Then coercion that is opposed to this as a hindering of a hindrance to freedom is consistent with freedom in accordance with universal laws. That is, it is right. So the only case in which coercion can justly be used as a hindrance to freedom is the case in which one person's exercise of freedom would unnecessarily hinder the freedom of another. The coercive force of the law, the collective exercise of coercion through the instrumentality of the state, can and must be used, but used only to hinder hindrances to the freedom of others. And conversely, any exercise of freedom that's compatible with the like degree of freedom for others must be permitted and indeed defended by the state. Now this is an argument, Kant's basic argument in political philosophy, that is entirely independent of any religious assumption. The application of this reasoning to the case of religious liberty proceeds without any further assumptions about the premises or point of religion. So Kant continues by dividing right into two main classes, what he calls innate right and acquired right, both of which are to be secured by the state, the operation of which in turn requires various offices and associated privileges that Kant analyzes under the further rubric of public right. These are categories that come from Roman law, so they're a little unfamiliar to us, perhaps. Innate right, in Kant's view, is, quote, the only original right belonging to every human being by virtue of his humanity, unquote. That is the right that everyone has in virtue of everyone else's obligation, always to treat their humanity as an end and never merely as a means. Acquired right is the right to particular properties or services that a human being can acquire by agreement with others, although the right to acquire acquired rights under appropriate circumstances is part of the innate right of human beings. And Kant then explains, this is the crucial part, that there's only one innate right, namely freedom. Independence from being constrained by another's choice insofar as it can coexist with the freedom of every other in accordance with a universal law. In other words, one has an innate right to whatever does not restrict the equal freedom of others. According to Kant, that's the foundational principle of all law and government. Now, Kant analyzes the innate right to freedom as comprising three authorizations, the last of which bears directly on the case of religion. The first authorization is, quote, equality, that is, independence from being bound by others to more than one can in turn bind them, unquote. In other words, the right to be one's own master. The second is the quality of being, quote, beyond reproach, since before a person has performed any acts affecting rights, he has done no wrong to anyone, unquote. These authorizations, I think, embody what Anglo-American tradition calls equality before the law and the presumption of innocence. Then comes the authorization that I'm particularly interested in, namely one's, quote, being authorized to do to others anything that does not in itself diminish what is theirs, so long as they do not want to accept it. Such things as merely communicating one's thoughts to them, telling or promising them something, whether what he says is true and sincere or untrue and insincere, for it is entirely up to them, the others, whether they want to believe one or not, unquote. In other words, one is free to do anything that does not diminish the freedom of others in a way that one's own freedom is not being diminished. You can believe anything you want, since that does not directly diminish the freedom of others. You can also say or act in any way you want, before others or to them, in any way that does not directly diminish their freedom. Of course, you cannot manipulate others or trick them by your words or deeds, since that would directly diminish their freedom, by inducing them to do something that they would not otherwise freely choose to do. But as long as you're not forcing them to believe anything, thus directly diminishing their freedom, you can say anything you want to them without violating their innate right to freedom. The implication of this for the case of religion is then clear. As long as your religious belief or action or absence thereof does not directly diminish the freedom of others, it must be tolerated and indeed defended by the state. But conversely, of course, if it does directly diminish the freedom of others, then there's an issue for the state. Now, in an appendix to the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant makes it explicit that this entails the necessity of both non-establishment and toleration or free exercise of religion by the state. Kant begins here by denying the state any right to regulate churches, that is, religious organizations, for any reason but public peace, and then denies churches themselves any right to restrict belief and inquiry. It's a long quote, I'll just read part of it. He says that a state does not have the right to legislate the internal constitution of churches or to organize them in accordance with its own views in ways it deems advantageous to itself, that is, to prescribe to the people or command beliefs and forms of divine worship. A state has only a negative right to prevent public teachers from exercising an influence on the visible political commonwealth that might be prejudiced to public peace, not letting a dispute arising within a church or among different churches endanger civil harmony. The supreme political authority especially has no right to prohibit internal reform of churches, for what the whole people cannot decide upon for itself, the legislator also cannot decide for the people. But no people can decide never to make further progress in its insight, enlightenment, regarding beliefs, and so never to reform its churches, since this would be opposed to the humanity in their own persons, and so to the highest right of the people. Now, I think this statement is carefully crafted. First, Kant accepts the premises shared by Locke and Mendelssohn alike, that the state does not have the means to directly modify inner dispositions. But he's already obviated any possible objection to the factual truth of this claim, to which the earlier philosophers were open, by his argument that no matter what, everyone has an innate right to their own opinions. So even if the state could find a way to modify inner convictions, it has no right to do so. Second, Kant makes it clear that whatever rights the state has in regard to religion descend exclusively from the rights that the people have in regard to religion. These include the rights to believe and practice religion any way they see fit, as long as that does not compromise their own freedom or the freedom of others. But now Kant also makes it explicit that the inviolable right of freedom itself includes the freedom of continued inquiry itself into any and all matters. So no human can compromise his own innate right to continued investigation of the truth of religion. Therefore, neither can the church, the state, nor any church whose powers descend only through legitimate contract from the powers of the individual, no matter where this might lead, even as Kant hints in his more explicit controversy with Mendelssohn in the religion book. Sorry, I didn't have time to talk about Friedrich Wilhelm II and his nasty little minister, Bollner. Even as Kant hints in his explicit controversy, if it might lead to the supersession of organized religion altogether. As long as there's no threat to public peace, freedom of religious belief, practice, and inquiry must be unrestricted by both state and churches themselves. That, in Kant's view, is part of the innate right of humanity. So, like Mendelssohn, Kant concludes that neither the state nor any church has the power to use coercion over the religious beliefs and practices of individuals as long as they do not threaten public peace. But unlike Mendelssohn and the others before him, Kant's argument insists upon the most extensive religious liberty consistent with public peace, while resting on no religious premises at all. It rests simply on the innate right to freedom, which ought to be hard for anyone to deny, even the devout believer, as long as he is honest about how important it is to him to be the kind of devout believer that he wants to be. I believe that it's an advantage of Kant's argument for religious liberty that it doesn't depend on any religious premise, only on a fundamental premise that one might think any clear-thinking person might be persuaded to accept. I also believe that Kant's view has the advantage of specificity even over that of a later non-religious defender of liberty, including religious liberty, namely John Stuart Mill, for whom I have the highest regard in many ways. Mill's view in On Liberty of 1863 is that everyone has the right to do whatever does not harm anyone else. However, here the problem is that people can define what harms them in different ways. And some people seem to take difference with, rejection of, or even indifference to their religious views as an offense and harm to themselves. But Kant is specific that it's freedom that is not to be harmed. So unless people can prove that difference with their religious views harms their own freedom to believe what they want and to practice as they wish, consistent with the freedom of others to do the same, they have no ground to claim that their right is harmed. This, I believe, is the Archimedean point that needs to be insisted upon in contemporary discussions of religious liberty as much as ever. So, thank you for your attention.
We have about 15, 20 minutes for questions.
Chris.
Great talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is there a question in there?
It's coming. I think the way the Constitution is usually understood, the state can't coerce religious practices, but it also can't persuade people to undertake various practices. And I just wonder if either the arguments of Kant, or either in Kant or the argument of Mendelssohn, really give you that, are strong enough to really give you that result. I mean, they seem, insofar as they're rooted in objections to restricted freedom, to rule out coercion on the part of the state. But persuasion on the part of the state is an entirely different thing. And I wonder if they seem to allow room, in fact, for persuasive techniques. So I wonder if they, would they say, you're right, I need more arguments, or that's fine, I'm happy to just, all I really need to do is to rule out.
Yeah, so I think that is a genuine risk of Mendelssohn's position, and he is actually pretty clear that the state can use persuasive educational methods as well as religion, and I think that opens his position up to that objection. I'd like to think that Kant is not open to that objection. That comes partly, I guess you have to go and present his political philosophy in more detail than I did here. But his conception of the function of the state is really that it is essentially our collective enterprise to prevent injuries to our freedom, and that the state as such ought to be entirely indifferent to its constituents' happiness. That is, it's up to the constituents to use their freedom as they see fit, whether in the view of anyone in the state that's the best way to secure their happiness or not. So that may seem like an excessively restrictive view of the function of the state, and you can think of various kinds of contexts in which that might seem sort of perhaps excessively libertarian, but that's the function of the state he's concerned. So when it comes to trying to impose any particular conception of happiness on people, in Mendelssohn's terms, temporal or eternal happiness, that in Kant's view is just not the business of the state. The state is to secure the freedom to use property as you see fit, to acquire property consistent with equal rights for others, to enter into contracts, to enter into relations of service, etc. And sort of that's it. So it would turn on his response to that would turn on his view that it's simply not the business of the state to try to promote happiness. That's the business of other kinds of voluntary human associations, for sure, but not the state. Charles.
Thank you indeed for the terrific talk. I'm not, however, persuaded that Kant gives us a secure argument for religious liberty than Mendelssohn or the other people who mentioned on the other side. You said at one point that the line of argument that Mendelssohn and Locke and Madison used to the effect that coercion cannot produce conviction is questionable. I think you're absolutely right about that. And one of the ways it's questionable was pointed out by, a couple of decades after Kant, by the brilliant but unsavory French reactionary Joseph de Maistre, who said, yes, once a person has convictions, you can't change them by coercion. However, convictions have empirical conditions. The fact that people have certain convictions depends on the education they've received, the experience they've had. And what one can do is make sure that people have the right sort of education, the right sort of experiences to produce the kind of convictions you want them to have, right? So in that sense, generationally speaking, for instance, you can, by coercion, produce conviction. And that's because convictions have empirical conditions. Now, freedom has empirical conditions too, right? The capacity for freedom is a capacity we develop in virtue of the education we receive, the experiences we've had, the people who've had formative influences on the way our life has gone. And freedom is, as a capacity, you know, to exercise a certain amount of self-control. It's a capacity to have a certain kind of openness to some possibilities and a closeness to other sorts of possibilities. It's a capacity for knowing how to deal with the kinds of demands that people make upon our agency and so forth. Freedom in that sense as a capacity has its empirical conditions just as convictions do. And so therefore it remains open for someone to argue that the only way to give someone the kind of capacities that are necessary for freedom is by way of the right sort of religious instruction. Only religious instruction can tell people how to discipline themselves, how to know what possibilities to take seriously and what possibilities to. This, of course, is a line of argument with which we're very, very familiar, right? Religion is the bedrock of morality, and in particular the capacity for religion, also for freedom. So it seems to me that Kant's argument is not really on a secure basis than Mendelssohn's, with one proviso. That is, of course, that Kant had notoriously, I would say, not to his credit, a very bizarre idea of freedom, according to which we have a capacity for freedom that doesn't rest on empirical conditions, transcendental freedom and all that stuff, which, of course, is a highly controversial view. But if you just recognize that freedom has empirical conditions, then it seems to be quite open for people to say, well, we've got to provide those empirical conditions. How are we going to make people, give people the capacity for freedom if not by giving them the right sorts of beliefs, namely religious beliefs? So I don't see, I mean, I'm with you what you want, but I'm not seeing how Kant's argument for what we want is any better in the end than Mendelssohn.
Well, I think there's quite a step between agreeing to your premise that freedom needs to be promoted and developed under specific empirical circumstances, and the further claim that that necessarily involves some religious form of education. That seems to me a big step, and I can see ways in which one could persuade people of the value of freedom and help them develop it without introducing any specific religious beliefs. I mean, where religious beliefs would involve postulation of a creator, the attribution of particular intentions for human being, or with regard to human beings to that creator, etc. I mean, this is, I think, in a way, the most difficult point about trying to reconstruct any persuasive form of Kantian moral philosophy, but the basic idea would be, roughly speaking, that you get people to see that they value their own freedom, and maybe that's not always so easy, but then you also show that, and then you add to that sort of pretty basic conception of rationality as consisting in treating like cases like, and try to persuade them that, well, they value their own freedom, other people value their freedom, etc. There's no difference between you and anyone else, so your freedom is not more valuable than anyone else's, and so on and so forth. I don't see that as necessarily involving religious premises. But, I mean, it seems to me that sort of the main, or for me at least, the main attraction of Kant's view is the idea that, in a sense, the state is not involved in the business of promoting people's happiness, because That's always going to be their happiness under some conception or other of their happiness, some view about what their happiness consists in. And one person's view about what their happiness consists in is not necessarily going to be the same as that of others. Whereas restricting the state to this securing the conditions for freedom, which of course involves many kinds of positive steps to make sure that freedom is of equal value to people, kind of puts a certain, at least it gives you the idea of a certain restriction on the powers of the state, which will prevent it from trying to impose a particular conception of happiness on people. Yes.
So I'm a planetary scientist, so I spend most of my time off Earth, and I'm wondering if you bring me back to this planet by explaining exactly what Kant and maybe Madison, discussing this with the Virginia legislature, would have said about the current administration and religious fundamentalism in the U.S.
Well, I don't think either one of them would have liked it very much.
What have been their arguments? What kind of relevant to today for all of us?
So, I mean, this is the basic difference between the two. Madison's view, at least as he expresses it in that piece, is that the only thing that is of religious value, the only thing that is well-pleasing, can possibly be well-pleasing to God, is the freely arrived at convictions of individuals. So even if you fully believe in God and you're committed to religion, the idea of using anything coercive, and that includes monies raised by taxation, to inculcate religion is self-contradictory. It undermines the purpose of religion. Whereas Kant's view is simply that the function of the state is simply to secure the equal freedom of the individuals, or the greatest degree of freedom for each individual, consistent with the same degree of freedom for everyone else. That, of course, is not, unbridled freedom for any one person, but, some consistent set of freedoms. So attempting to promote particular convictions isn't the way to do that. Now, of course, then, someone's open to something like the objection that Charles just made, which is that, well, but maybe a religious view is the way to promote the respect for freedom itself. But you'd have to make a pretty convincing argument that it's the only way to do that. Michelle.
So even if we concede that Immanuel Kant has a sound argument against the establishment of religion, it's something more, right? That's not sufficient to establish what you just suggested about not using taxation to support religious groups, right? So we can imagine a regime where so-called tolerant religions would gain support from taxes. That you can imagine a regime where one wasn't coerced into practicing a particular state-sanctioned religion, but the state would support religions that were reasonably pluralistic. So maybe only the Unitarian Universalists and the Quakers would get money from taxes, but I don't see anything yet that Mendelssohn or Kant has said against that regime. So was that even within the scope of things they were considering? And do you think that they have an argument, even if they didn't consider it, that by implication would apply to a case like that?
Well, I think they're both pretty clear, but Kant particularly clear that, so gentle as it may often seem, the essence of the state is coercion. So when you're raising tax money, you're raising it by coercion. There are sanctions threatened if you don't pay your taxes. And if you don't pay your taxes, for those sanctions to continue to be effective for yourself in the future or others, they will have to be imposed, right? So we just think of, Well, that, I mean, that's what Madison was talking about, is taxation, and that, Kant thinks the state works through coercion. So wherever coercion can be justified as a hindrance to freedom, then it's okay. But where some admirable goal might be achieved by some means of coercion, that's not okay. So I think that's the basic view. And but more generally, I think on that question, I think the kind of arguments that Martha Nussbaum made in her book on religious liberty and conscience 10 years ago, I don't buy everything, because I think the way she foregrounds the value of conscience as that which is to be defended by the religious liberties itself, already giving it a bit of a religious spin. But nevertheless, she's absolutely right, I think, when she talks about the way in which privileging any religion, even if it's a tolerant one, is going to make some people feel like second-class citizens, that they're not part of that. I felt uncomfortable having to recite the Pledge of Allegiance when I was a student, after Eisenhower had put one nation indivisible under God in there, because it's not how I thought of things, even at age 10 or whatever. And I think that's an important argument. So that's why I talk about religious liberty, but not toleration. One last question, gentleman over there.
Really interesting talk. I guess I learned a lot, and one of the things I liked about it was that I never really understood how Locke's arguments were so connected to Protestantism, but I think that's absolutely correct. Even the point about conviction versus action, it's just, the whole idea of works versus faith is clearly influencing that idea, that what matters is what you believe rather than what you do. Well, that's actually a Protestant idea. That's not a neutral idea. I guess my question or my quibble or my about is sort of twofold. One is just the question of, can you really say that Kant's view of freedom isn't religious? I don't really see how that particular view of his philosophy and argument about, your inherent freedom as an individual, how that isn't basically a religious conviction. You can call it not religious, or you can say it's not based on belief in a creator, but that's it seems to me to be just almost semantics as to why that particular strong belief is any different than the strong belief that that we get from Locke. It's based on a certain idea of individualism, it seems to me, and that's sort of my second point, which is in terms of how does this all matter in the 21st century. And it strikes me that both of these arguments are excessively dependent on the idea of individualism. Religion is a social thing. Human beings are social animals. The idea of me practicing my religion by myself with my creator is frankly completely alien to me. It makes absolutely no sense to me as a human being, or to me, in terms of my faith. You have to practice it with other people. And even the idea of pluralism is the idea of communities of different groups of people, not isolated atomistic individuals who all have this Kantian freedom that they all have, that they can exercise without impinging on other people's freedom. What are you talking about? We live in groups, we're social animals. My views and convictions are based on the social milieu in which I live, in which my family lives, and my experiences that are shaped by a whole bunch of things that have absolutely nothing to do with my free-form thought, darkness.
Well, I think you put your finger on a genuine issue. I think that there's probably more variation in this room about the degree to which people conceive of themselves as individuals versus as parts of a group, the degree to which they're comfortable in thinking that way than you're allowing. You're giving a sort of, I think, one extreme of a view, and whereas a kind of radical individualism would be at another extreme. But I like to think, and maybe I'm not sure I have found a compelling argument for this or by any means, but I like to think that Even people for whom membership in a group of some kind or other is extremely important, and who conceive of, whose identity is very strongly based on membership in a group, would, if you could sit them down quietly in a peaceful corner, ultimately agree that it's very important to them that in the end that they get to be a member of the group that they want to be a member of, that they get to choose, that they are not being forced to be a member of this group, that they are at some level voluntarily accepting the membership in this group. I think you could get a lot of people to agree, even if they would sort of begin talking about themselves in very group-oriented terms, that at some point they would see that point. And then you get the point, okay, fine. If that's important to you, that it be voluntary, it's important to other people that the way they live is, to the degree possible, voluntary, even if they don't choose to identify with your group, or they don't choose to identify with a group so strongly as you do. I like to think that anyway.
Great. Please join me in thanking Paul.
Thank you.